Just wait a moment for Jesus to rebuke the waves and the wind. So this is the first Sunday after Labor Day. It's often seen as the beginning of a new church year, and indeed we're starting a new trajectory in the narrative lectionary, a new year which will be a year focused on the Gospel of Matthew, with a fair number of Old Testament stories, important ones, woven in. September 11th is also a day that is in our minds as a day of great disaster, which has led to great disaster and great disaster. So it's an interesting day to read a story meant to be a story of hope, because we find ourselves woven into many stories. And in this time of talking about trouble, I just ask for blessings upon our work together, that we may find our way to deeper faith, to stronger love, greater hope, and yes, enormous joy. When I stand up here to present a sermon, I like to begin by remembering how much I love each one of you, this deep love that I cultivate in prayer and meditation, and that I cultivate in relationships. And it's not just because you listen to me speak. It's not the only reason. It's not hard to think about this love. Also, when I set out to give a sermon, my intention is always to find hope and share that hope with you. It looks different for each of us at different times, this hope. And maybe it looks different today too. But I'm myself reaching for hope of healing and renewal for each of us as well as the world. There are many symbols in this ark story, not just this symbol of hope with the rainbow. And I'm hoping to weave my way among some of these symbols today, not only with the help of the ancient writers and the help of Marin Tirabassi, but with the help of a comedian and also two bioethicists. To begin, as Tirabassi says, we read the story of Noah's journey. It is not for children, and it is not about kangaroos. It's really about a barely conceivable challenge. A barely conceivable challenge. This challenge of facing an overwhelming flood by building an ark. Interesting how we situate ourselves among the ark passengers and not among the drownees. And in a sense, in our current setting, we are among the ark passengers. We have homes, we have food. We are not flooded out. We are not fleeing a war or famine or drought. We're on the ark. And so part of our question is, what does it mean to be on the ark? When some of us don't feel like we're on the ark because of other things that are happening in our lives. So the ethicists I'm going to be working with are David Schenck and Larry Churchill, who are longtime medical ethicists who have worked with people in really difficult medical situations, people facing not just a terminal diagnosis, but just unimaginable diagnoses, a child born with a birth defect or a genetic problem that we simply have no solution for. and parents facing what will their life be like with this child, as one example. And Schenck and Churchill point us to a possibility of thinking about ethics in a different way. Now, bioethicists, medical ethicists, have tended to think for the last maybe 40 years in terms of principles. What principles are we dealing with here, and how will they inform our decisions? Principles such as patient autonomy, one that has grown very prominent in recent years. But it's not always obvious what patient autonomy would or should mean in a given setting. But sometimes we need to respond to things when we don't have time for such ethical contemplation. We need to be ready to respond. And so they propose a set of, they call them ethical maxims, short statements that we can practice and remember and use to help us know a good decision, or the best possible decision in the circumstances, or a decision that meets our ethical commitments. Because they're talking in this article, very unusually for them and for any bioethicist in a medical journal, they're talking about climate change and the devastation, the collapse that will come on a global scale as a result of the climate change that is already underway. We don't know exactly how things will play out. We don't know how much humans will be able to change their ways of life and so enable a healthier climate for the earth. We don't know those things. But in any case, we are already seeing effects of climate change, droughts and floods and fires. And so they're saying, as physicians, as medical ethicists, we need to think about these things too. Because the prospect is almost unthinkable. It's barely conceivable. And even to think about this can make us anxious. It can make us distressed. It can make it difficult to keep thinking and talking about these things. And so their challenge to us is to find ways to do that. Noah and his family found favor, and so have we. And we can't explain why. We are simply humans like every other human. And yet, here we are. We are on the ark. And the story that is told here is the story told by the survivors, because anyone who drowned is not going to be there to tell the story of what happened. And it's important for us to keep our eyes open to the whole story, not just the story of ourselves, but of the people around us, the communities around us, the world around us, to the extent that we're able. For some of us, facing a family medical crisis, that's where we can practice our ethics right now. For some of us who have some time in our days when we can think about larger issues, maybe there is some other way that we can respond. But in any case, I think that the maxims that Schenck and, oh dear, now his name's flown out of my head, our two bioethics maxim writers, these are relevant, I think, at any time. What they say, sort of at root, is that we have to move from kind of a thinking, observing understanding of the situation to actually feel in our bodies what this predicament means. So that the kinds of anxiety and stress that we experience are not such that they will stop us, but such that we know how to respond to them. Because these maxims are for people who have given up hope. There's no ordinary hope that by itself can respond to the situations that we face. We have to abandon that hope, and we have to find a new and radical hope. It's the kind of hope that families must find in catastrophic, life-threatening situations in the hospital, for example. But as humans on the earth, we too. I noticed as I read through this Noah passage many times this week that the word covenant keeps jumping out. And covenant, of course, is an important word in our religious tradition. It's a word that talks about a commitment, an agreement, a mutual promise. And one of the things that we know is that God sustains the covenant, but that humans continually mess up. We are always having to practice to follow these the covenants that we have made. So our bioethicists say, yes, we should mount an all-out effort to engineer and install the kinds of technologies that we need. But we can't count on it being enough and in time. And so, in addition to changing our lives in practical ways, we're going to be adapting morally, socially, adapting to a new situation. Now, each of us have adapted to many new and difficult situations in our lifetimes. We've lost a parent or a partner or a child. We've lost a job or lost a home or so many things. So we have experienced this kind of loss that throws us away from ordinary hope and makes us need to cultivate a new and radical hope. So at the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window and he sent out the raven. And it went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. And Tirabassi says, God, in the drowned places where monsoon swept through with wind and flood, so many ravens go out and do not return with needed help. And I think here of the articles I read this week about the floods in Pakistan, where so many people, a third of the country underwater, so many people escaping to roads, the only elevated structures in their regions, camping out on roads, cut off by flooded places, with no help in sight. It reminds me, too, of situations of war where people are attacked with no help in sight, or famine, or fire. Part of the message here, I think, is to prepare ourselves to be helpers. And how do we do that? Tirabassi says, feather us like doves to bring many branches of hope. It is not just one branch of hope. Feather us like doves to bring many branches of hope. And so we must. Now, a dove feather is a very small thing. or can be. The biggest ones aren't very big, and they have many very small feathers. So may we. Maybe we'll start with small feathers. At the end of the Noah passage, we hear God saying repeatedly, "As for me, I'm establishing my covenant with you. This is the sign of the covenant. I have set my bow, and it shall be a sign of the covenant." We hear repetition, repetition, repetition. And in a sense, this is what we talk about with a maxim, an ethical maxim, that we learn it so well, we repeat it so well, that when we need it, it comes to mind. And Tirabasi says, may we receive this rainbow too. You set a rainbow in the sky, promising not to destroy the earth. But we humans promise no such thing. We promised no such thing. God covenants and covenants and covenants, and this covenant doesn't demand a particular response from us. And so Tirabasi says, rather this and disasters yet to come, sad fruit of climate broken. You know, I do want to think of the story of Noah and the ark as a story of hope. The many hopeful images from it, such as the print that we have here of the animals in the ark. The many images that we carry of success, of achievement, of survival. I want to carry that. And I want to carry the thought that God has kept the covenant. God has not caused these floods. These floods are in part natural phenomena of low-lying areas, and also in part caused by humans. So maybe time to start a covenant. Now, I was surprised to find stories about a comedian named Eddie Izzard, whom I had never heard of, and who had a stand-up tour he called Glorious. And it was set in the wreck of an old temple, solo performance, and he starts off, Izzard jumps off with a dialogue among himself and God and Noah. Now, he does God and Noah in the voices of familiar actors, which of course is part of the humor, but I'm not going to attempt that. But in this version, Noah wants a speedboat with a big motor. And God repeatedly comes back to an element that was left out of the biblical version, called a big room for poo. Poo. We don't usually think about poo in the Noah story, but it makes sense. I mean, 100-something days in an ark, all those animals and people, where's the poo going to go? Well, you know, another funny thing here is that Izzard, who's a comedian, is not the first person to write about this. Back in the 2nd and 3rd century, Origen, one of our church fathers, specified that it was the lower portion of the ark that was given over to the excrements. In the 15th century, Alfonso Tostado explained this complex plumbing system that would have solved the problem of waste. So this is a well-known problem. But Izzard has more for us. In Izzard's story, the ducks refuse to get on board. They say, we don't need to. We're always in water. And so the ducks begin to destroy this plan to destroy all life. So Izzard like we Christian interpreters can go into this story and find gaps and see if we can't imagine what might have happened. And in the Jewish tradition, there are many, many stories about Noah and the ark that fill in those gaps. Beautiful stories, funny stories, helpful stories. So you don't have to accept the story as given. Just think about that big room of poo. So here are 6 ethical maxims. 6 ethical maxims. Principles to guide us. How to act. And one of the things they mention is that when we work with ethical principles, such as the principle of patient autonomy, these principles show us how to think, but they don't tell us what to do. But when we think about these maxims, they are an attempt for us to develop through practice a way of acting. And they're a lot like wisdom sayings or philosophical sayings that are passed down in every culture, including Christian culture. And they're more like virtues, more like practicing virtues in the Aristotelian sense, the way Aristotle said we should practice virtues. More that than, say, following Immanuel Kant's principle-based way of ethics. So maybe they're slogans. They say ultimately they're really spiritual exercises. And this is something that, as people of faith, we have some understanding of spiritual exercises. And so if we hear them in this way, perhaps it will be helpful. In an aside, they comment, and I hadn't thought quite about this before. When we use the principles of bioethics, we imagine that we're working in an age of relative abundance, stability, and progress. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about relative scarcity, disruption. Who knows what direction things are moving in? So part of it is learning to see as things are. So here's the first maxim. Work hard to grasp the immensity. Often when we encounter a difficult situation, our first move is to kind of shore up who we think we are and to set ourselves where we are. But here, to practice opening ourselves to really look and see, to accept. Because then, when we accept and when we give up hope, we can begin with our second maxim, which is to cultivate radical hope. Some people call it open hope. Some call it active hope. And it's not a direct route to this hope, because first, there's grief and anger. There is grief and anger, and we can't avoid that. And there's often blaming ourselves or blaming someone else. We're going to have to give that up. It doesn't help what we need to do. So, for this maxim, we're looking for faith in a possible future. However unlikely, but faith in a possible future, that there will be a future. And our action pointed to deal with that future. Maxim 3, have a line in the sand. Know that there are some things that you will not do, some modes of living you will not embrace. know that there are lives worse than death, and be prepared to die. And they compare this maxim to the practice in medicine of having advance directives, that people think ahead of time under what conditions would they like to be kept alive and sustained, and under what conditions would they, if they were able to, would they say, let me go? If you have no brain function, would you say, let me go? Or would you say, keep me alive as long as possible? And that's what they mean here. Know that there are lives worse than death, and be prepared to die. That wasn't very funny. I don't know why I laughed. Maxim 4, appreciate this astonishing and unique opportunity. This extraordinary transition has never been lived before. And for us to be present here in our lives, on this earth, at this time, there's much to be amazed by. Our own bodies, the way everything is so interconnected, how complex things are, and how thinking about something small or thinking about something big, both of these remind us how astonishing this life is. Joanna Macy, who's a Buddhist teacher and well-known writer on environmental concerns, says, time to appreciate that there is anything at all, and that we have witnessed it. Maxim 5, train your body and your mind. And here they talk about things that perhaps many of us have learned to practice. Breathing exercises, physiological capacity to deal with despair. Because if we practice in situations of despair, if we practice breathing, meditating, praying, doing the kinds of things that strengthen our ability to keep functioning in difficult situations, and there's a long list, and I'm sure you've all heard it from your doctors. This is part of what we need to do to train our body and our mind. And another one in training our mind is to learn to jump to different time scales. So this very moment, this wonderful and beautiful very moment, or the 5 billion years until the Milky Way galaxy is absorbed into its neighbor. 5 billion years. When Annie and I saw a video this spring or summer with David Attenborough talking about the last day of the dinosaurs, if you haven't seen it, it's good. One thing that Annie came away saying to me, and I understood what she meant. She said, this gives me hope. Because we had just watched this story of utter devastation of almost all life on Earth. And she said, and look at this. It's only, 65 million years later, I'm going to forget the number wrong. But look at life now. Earth is resilient. That resilience is a source of hope. Maxim 6, act for the future generations of all species. So as we choose our actions, it's not just for our own benefit or the benefit of our own neighbors. It's for the benefit of all to which we are connected. And personally, to the extent that we are able, limit the damage being done to the biosphere. And there may be political actions we can take as well to influence others. But ultimately, our bioethicists say these are the fundamental questions. What kind of person will you be? And what will you teach and model for your colleagues and friends and students and families? What kind of person will you be? They admit that this is an enormously difficult list, and any of us could practice these maxims for a long time and have more to practice. And in fact, I am meeting with a group of friends from our garden club in the East Bay to talk our way through this article and these maxims to see how we can practice them. And I was thinking, as I thought about talking about this here in our congregation, that we have some practices that are not mentioned in the article that I think are extremely important. And one of them is that you build community, that you meet people whom you can connect with and that you talk with and share your life with and whom you support, because we are not going to survive a family trauma, a neighborhood trauma, a city trauma, climate change, anything by ourselves. That's not the nature of the human being. And some of the ways that we have to face these things, I was thinking, for example, that image of Jesus standing in that boat in the storm, rebuking the wind and the waves, and thinking, can I have this Jesus walk around with me and be ready to say, it's okay, it's okay. Why be afraid? Look at your fear, understand your fear, and move in a new, hopeful direction. Find that radical hope that leads us into a beautiful, unimaginable future. Amen. Now we'll turn to our anthem, J.S. Bach, Suite 3, Gigue.